European politicians reacted with shock to the UK's decision to leave the European Union.
I will do everything I can as Prime Minister to steady the ship over the coming weeks and months. But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination.
Yes, well, as the left moved right under Blair, who came from the northeast, of course, and the right moved left under Major, and even further left under Cameron, they ended up together in this corporatist, elitist system which combined left and right, but didn't represent the people anymore.
I want to reassure everybody that, in my view, as a result of this, Britain will continue to be a great European power.
We'll get our own back. We'll show them who's in charge. We're in charge, and we're going to vote to leave.
London just does not have a clue, and the people of London, the politicians especially, they've lived a little cushy life in London, being looked after, getting £60,000 expenses a year and a £70,000 wage. They don't have any idea how normal people live anymore.
This means that the UK has voted to leave the European Union.
You've said as Prime Minister you could not countenance a delay beyond June the 30th. So I ask you again, what will you do if the EU insists on a longer delay?
I'm working to ensure that we can leave the European Union within the timescale that the government wants to see. I want us to have to be able to leave the European Union in a smooth and orderly way as soon as possible. And that's what I'm going to be working for.
We heard a couple of weeks ago, Ollie Robbins, the chief Brexit negotiator, talking loudly in a Brussels bar that was reported by ITV that this was exactly the Prime Minister's strategy. It was going to be to run down the clock as we get even closer to Brexit Day and then offer MPs a choice. You either take my deal or there's going to be a very long delay to Brexit.
It's just sad the way things have turned out.
Yeah.
Because you got Theresa May there, I think she'll be a turncoat.
Should be a turncoat?
Yeah, she'll just stick in the EU.
The point about Brexit is to break free. It's about political independence. It's about being a self-governing nation where your laws are made by your own representatives in Parliament and where the highest court in the land at times is called into a judge. And what we've seen now, 3.25 years since the Brexit vote, is an attempt by the political class to redefine Brexit as somehow Brexit is staying part of the customs union or staying part of the single market, and it is not.
We might say of such architecture that it is modern in conception, but uncomfortable to live in, and likely to fall down in a few years. But is it even modern in conception? It was once. But look at the architecture of the last 50 years. Look in particular at the architecture that went beyond the modern to the futuristic. It was certainly a very dramatic architecture, but the one thing it no longer expresses is the future. But the Berlaymont School of Architecture is a convenient symbol for the political architecture of the European community, for it too is infused with the spirit of yesterday's future. Mr. Chairman, the European community we have today was created in very different circumstances to deal with very different problems. It was built upon very different assumptions about where the world was heading, and it embodied political ideas and economic theories that in the light of recent history we have to question. Today, I want to do exactly that. In particular, I shall try to answer 3 questions.
Excellent.
Not too fast.
Perfect pace.
First, how can we best deal with the imbalance in Europe created by the reunification and revival of Germany? Second, How can we reform European institutions so that they accommodate the diversity of post-communist Europe and be truly democratic? Third, how can we ensure that the new Europe contributes to, rather than undermines, the world's economic prosperity and political stability? Our answers to these questions can no longer be bound by the conventional collectivist wisdom of the 1940s and 50s. That is yesterday's future. We must draw on the ideas of liberty, democracy, free markets, and nationhood that have swept the world in the last decade. Then a short pause, and we transition to Winston.
At The Hague are gathered 800 delegates representing 23 European nations. Men and women of all walks of life, they, like France's wartime Premier Edward Daladier, have come to seek the first United States of Europe. The Dutch royal couple, welcoming Mrs. Churchill and Anthony Eden, greet the delegates, who include Leslie Hoare-Belisha. Not sponsored by any one government, yet willed by every nation, the Hague meeting seems to the people of Europe another groping but positive step for peace. Winston Churchill, in his role as world statesman, presides over the inaugural session. Party politics are thrust into the background as the man who gave Europe back its freedom receives the acclaim of its representatives.
You know that on many occasions, Churchill waxed lyrical about the prospects of European unity, but it was less clear what exactly he envisioned would be Britain's role. He also spoke in The Hague and expressed the hope that the Western democracies of Europe may draw together an even closer amity and even closer association.
I did not realize that, Mrs. Thatcher.
Indeed he did. Yet, in the same speech, he noted that the affairs of Great Britain and the British Commonwealth are becoming even more closely interwoven with those of the United States, and that an underlying unity of thought and conviction are increasingly happening in the English-speaking world. How were these grand and opposing concepts in practice to be reconciled?
The first step in the recreation of the European family must be a partnership between France and Germany. The structure of the United States of Europe, if well and truly built, will be such as to make the material strength of a single state less important. Small nations will count as much as large ones and gain their honor by their contribution to the common cause.
It was Winston Churchill who, with characteristic magnanimity, in 1946, with his Zurich speech, argued that Germany should be rehabilitated through what he called European Union, as an association between France and Germany, which would assume direction. This could not be done overnight, and it took American leadership. The German taxpayer pays dearly for its place in Europe. Britain and Germany have a strong joint interest in ensuring that the other community countries pay their fair share of the cost and control the community's spending more enthusiastically, without leaving us to carry so much of the burden. And the history of Europe since 1870 has largely been concerned with finding the right structure to contain Germany. Further details pertaining to Germany, Britain and France, then the Soviets, then we posit. Some 30 states have come into being, and the problem of German power has again surfaced, and statesmen have been scrambling to produce a solution to it. We then ask the question: if America is required to keep Europe secure, what is required to keep Europe free and democratic? When the founders of the European Community drew up the Treaty of Rome,
the Treaty of Rome committed its signatories to the progressive abolishment of customs duties within the common market in order to stimulate free trade between them. It also established a single set of import duties for goods entering the common market from outside.
They incorporated features from two quite different economic traditions. From liberalism, they took free trade, free markets, and competition. From socialism, in guises as various as social Catholicism and corporatism, they took regulation and intervention. And for 30 years, up to the signing of the Single European Act, these two traditions were in a state of perpetual but unacknowledged tension.
The European Commission. Leave it in or take it out. Or should I say, go light or go heavy?
Richard, there's no point in living an if-only life.
So heavy then.
Heavy it is. With the Commission exploiting the Single European Act to accumulate powers of greater direction and regulation, Europe is reaching the point at which it must choose between these two approaches. Is it to be a tightly regulated, centralized, bureaucratic federal state imposing uniform standards throughout the continent? Or is it to be a loose-knit, decentralized free market Europe of sovereign states based upon competition between different national systems of tax and regulation within a free market area? Mr. Delors, at least, seems to be quite clear.
Yes, the Commission does want to increase its powers. Yes, it is a non-elected body, and I do not want the Commission to increase its powers against this House. So, of course, we are differing. Of course, the chairman or the president of the Commission, Mr. Delors, said at press conference the other day that he wanted the European Parliament to be the democratic body of the community. He wanted the Commission to be the executive, and he wanted the Council of Ministers to be the Senate. No, no, no.
Are you absolutely certain that you want to name names and be so specific?
I am. Before the ink is even dry on the Maastricht Treaty, the President of the European Commission, who has always been admirably frank about his ambitions, is seeking more money and more powers for the Commission, which would become the executive of the community. In other words, a European government. So there is no doubt what the President of the Commission is aiming at. It is a tightly centralized European federal state. Nor is there any mystery about the urgency with which he presses the federalist cause. Even though he may wish to defer the enlargement of the community with the accession of Eastern Europe, he realizes it is impossible. A half Europe imposed by Soviet tyranny was one thing. A half Europe imposed by Brussels would be a moral catastrophe, depriving the community of its European legitimacy.
Hello, Thatcher Mobile 573, Mrs. Thatcher's private secretary speaking. Yes, she is. Very good. Of course. One moment, please. Excuse me, ma'am. There is a call for you from Mr. Terry Wogan of the BBC. Mr. Wogan would like to speak with you, again, about matters concerning the EU. Acknowledges the timing as they're acutely aware you're about to give a speech. Would you like me to set up a more appropriate time, ma'am?
Sam, how long would you estimate until our arrival?
Approximately 20 minutes, Mrs. Thatcher.
Thank you, Sam.
Yes. Let me put you right through, Mr. Wogan. Mr. Terry Wogan of the BBC.
Thank you, Shelley. Terry, so good to speak with you. Yes, that's quite all right. Of course. Perfect timing, actually. I have 10 minutes. I have 5 minutes, Terry. As we discussed, Europe lacks so much that would provide the solid foundations of statehood or imperial power that it can only exist through the satisfaction of accumulated vested interests. One only has to read a metric measure or two of European prose, culled from its directives, circulars, reports, communiques, and what passes debates in its parliament, and one will quickly realize that Europe is synonymous with bureaucracy. It is government by bureaucracy for bureaucracy, to which one might add to, from, and with bureaucracy if one were so minded. Of course, Terry. What makes Europe the ultimate bureaucracy is that it is ultimately sustained by nothing else. We must grasp from the lessons of European history. First, there is nothing necessarily benevolent about programs of European integration. Second, desires to achieve grand utopian plans often possess a grave threat to freedom. And third, European unity has been tried before, and the outcome was far from happy. If Europe charms us, as it has so often charmed me, it is precisely because of its contrasts and contradictions, not its coherence and continuity. It is hard to imagine anything less likely to be molded into a successful political unit in this extraordinarily uneven mix of unlike with like. Perhaps the most significant shortcoming of the fledgling superstate is that it is not, will not be, indeed ultimately cannot be democratic. The real reason that there can be no pan-European democracy is that there exists no pan-European public opinion. No matter how many attempts are made to create links between the political parties of different European countries, those parties know that they have to campaign upon and that their fortunes will be determined by national programs and issues. The impact of European questions on such elections is most likely to be negative. When something that Europe favors, such as open borders or more immigration, props popular anger. Well, Terry, the counterpart of Europe's lack of democracy is its lack of accountability. There is simply not sufficient public interest in the conduct of Europe's politicians and high officials to place it under continuing effective scrutiny. The resulting remoteness is a recipe for abuse in power, misuse of public funds, and in some cases outright corruption. None of this is at all surprising. If you combine within a single system centralized decision-making, the cultural secrecy, and the elimination of genuine debate about ends and means, you can hardly complain of the ensuing graft and incompetence. It is frequently said to be unthinkable that Britain should leave the European Union. But the avoidance of thought about this, as about other matters, is a poor substitute for judgment. It is only when we honestly weigh up the losses and gains that we can decide which is the sensible course. Very good, Terry. I'm afraid our time is up. We shall have to stop there. Of course. Bottom line, if we are receiving an unsatisfactory deal and we have no realistic chance of improving it, and if at the same time we are steadily losing our powers of self-government, that seems sufficient argument against further integration in Europe for me. Very good. Thank you, Terry. Speak with you again. Yes. One more question. Am I nervous or apprehensive about public speaking? Always. And you wouldn't speak well if you weren't. The moment you start, you forget about yourself completely. Thank you, Terry. Very good. Bye now. Nice job. Well, I think that went rather well.
Very well indeed. It's a shame we don't have time to include more of the material just discussed with him.
It's all in there.
Yes, it is, dear.
Thank you, darling. You know, the blunt truth is that the rest of the European Union needs us more than we need them. It is just that we have managed to entangle ourselves with Europe in such a way that the strengths cannot at present be used effectively.
In the final phase of her career, she was fighting a losing battle against her own cabinet on the issue of British membership of the European exchange rate mechanism. Almost her last major speech on Europe was the famous no, no, no speech on the Delors plan for a federal Europe. Now, she was completely right about that. I mean, look at it now. What a mess the Europeans are in because of the single currency. What a disaster the whole project for a European federation has turned out to be. And yet she was overthrown partly because of her opposition on that issue. She was dead right.
Consider the following 3 negotiating advantages which we enjoy. First, we are substantial net importers from the rest of the EU. The fact remains that those European importers into Britain are of enormous importance to European companies and their workforces. Second, Europe will continue to want access to our waters and our fish. We are, as I have described, substantial contributors to the CAP, and the prospect of an end to that bounty might send our partners into a lather. Third, no matter how much the Europeans huff and puff about a common European foreign and security policy and a common defense, they know perfectly well that Britain, as a European power, is in a league of her own. We must seek to achieve, as far as possible, the basic, sensible objectives of the European single market. That is, a common recognition of standards, and open markets free of subsidies, distortions, and non-tariff barriers, but without over-regulation, abuse of powers by the Commission, and unwelcome intrusions by the European Court. And Britain must regain control of its trade policy. Our interests lie primarily in global not European markets.
A prominent Labour politician, Lisa Nandy, has now come out and said that she would happily support the Prime Minister's Brexit plan if certain requirements were met. And it seems like Theresa May might meet those requirements. And one of those is an all UK-wide backstop. Basically, that means that the UK would stay within the customs union, which is obviously the organisation that makes trade deals on behalf of member states within it. So, for example, Turkey is within it. You don't actually have to be in the EU to be in the customs union. But it basically means giving up two things. One, you cannot make your own free trade deals around the world. And two, you cannot collect your own tariff revenue on your behalf. It all goes to Brussels. So that means Britain is giving up billions of pounds of revenues in tariffs. And it also means that Britain's giving up the ability to set your own rates of tariffs or taxes on goods coming in and out of the country. And it also means Britain can't sign free trade deals around the world, which is the whole point of Brexit. Why do you think we voted to leave in 2016 if we can't make our own free trade deals around the world?
Well, as the saying goes, you're preaching to the choir.
How are we on time?
About 10 minutes out, ma'am.
Very well. Let's continue. I believe we left off...
The Commission knows. Page 5.
Yes, thank you. The Commission knows it will have to admit new members in the next few decades, but it hopes to construct a centralized European superstate in advance and irrevocably, so that the new members will have to apply for entry on federalist terms. This is not so much constructing a common European home as a common European prison, and it's just not on. Imagine a European community of 30 nations ranging in their economic productivity from Germany to Ukraine, and in their political stability from Britain to Poland, all governed from Brussels, all enforcing the same conditions at work, all having the same worker rights as the German unions, all subject to the same interest rates, monetary, fiscal, and economic policies, all agreeing on a common foreign and defense policy, and all accepting the authority of an executive and remote foreign parliament over 80% of economic and social legislation. Mr. Chairman, such a body is an even more utopian enterprise than the Tower of Babel. For at least the builders of Babel all shared a common language when they began.
I'm most grateful to the Prime Minister. Will she tell us whether she intends to continue her own personal fight against a single currency and an independent central bank when she leaves office?
No, she's going to be the governor.
On the present structure,
Order. The Prime Minister.
what a good idea. I hadn't thought of it. But if I were, there'd be no European Central Bank accountable to no one, least of all to national parliaments. Because the point of that kind of European Central Bank is no democracy taking powers away from every single parliament and being able to have a single currency and a monetary policy and an interest rates which takes all political power away from us. As my right honourable friend said in his first speech after the proposal of a single currency is about the politics of Europe. It is about a federal Europe by the back door.
Too much passion.
Proper.
Brilliant, ma'am.
The more the better, my dear.
Mr. Chairman, the thinking behind the Commission's proposal is essentially the thinking of yesterday's tomorrow. It was how the best minds of Europe saw the future in the ruins after the Second World War. But they made a central intellectual mistake. They assumed that the model for future government was that of a centralized bureaucracy that would collect information upwards, make decisions at the top, and then issue orders downwards. And what seemed the wisdom of the ages in 1945 was in fact a primitive fallacy. Hierarchical bureaucracy may be a suitable method of organizing a small business that is exposed to fierce external competition, but it is a recipe for stagnation and inefficiency in almost every other context. It is precisely this model of remote, centralized, bureaucratic organization that the European Commission and its federalist supporters seek to impose on a community which they acknowledge may soon contain many more countries of widely different levels of political and economic development, and speaking more than 15 languages. Shelley, will you please pull up my notes for tomorrow night's meeting with the Economic Advisors Committee? What time is that?
Airport is at 7:30. Meeting is at 5, ma'am.
Thank you, Shelley. Thank you, Shelley. Richard, let's go over this quickly while it's fresh in my mind.
Of course.
What those of us who believe that free market capitalism is the only reliable basis for economic progress are saying is not that we believe that there is no place in life for charity, or that only material things matter. Rather, we are asserting that in the vast majority of human undertakings, it is best to rely on man's pursuit of their own individual good to ensure that the wants of all are supplied.
I believe you won't keep political freedom unless you also have economic freedom, which means that you must have a large part of free enterprise in your whole economy.
As Adam Smith's formulations show, free enterprise capitalism is based upon a psychological insight, the human propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. It is through this propensity that what Smith calls the invisible hand operates to shape an economic order, whereby the individual pursuit of profit leads to the material benefit of society as a whole. I believe that it is possible to identify 5 conditions necessary for free enterprise capitalism to work effectively, by which I mean that it serves well the individual and the common interests of all involved. So I think we stop here and then list and define the 5 conditions, yes?
Absolutely, that works nicely. How much detail are you planning on going into?
Condition, then sentence, then brief description of each. Private property, rule of law, culture, diversity, and competition between states. I think we really need to stress this. Capitalism is the enemy of enforced homogeneity. It thrives on it and also promotes difference and individuality. Capitalism may not be culture blind, but it is color blind. Prejudice stands no chance in a free economy because it leads eventually to poverty.
She saved the nation. For the United Kingdom, the economy was in a real mess when she took over government. It was a mess that 3 previous governments had tried to resolve and failed, and yet she did. She took the basket case economy of Europe and turned it around into what was at that time quite a leading economy. That was a wonderful achievement. And in so doing, she inspired a whole generation of young people to believe in themselves and to believe that despite the fact that you were born into a poor family, you didn't have to be poor for the whole of your life, that the world was full of opportunities.
Agreed. Then tax and regulation, in that order?
Yes. And Condition 5 at some level is merely an extension of the rule of law.
Back to speech then.
Back to the speech.
If you are comfortable, let's pick back up at Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, in 1996, when the arrangements agreed at Maastricht are due to be reviewed, and probably a good deal sooner, the community should move in exactly the opposite direction to that proposed by the President of the Commission. A community of sovereign states committed to voluntary cooperation, a lightly regulated free market, and international free trade does not need a commission in its present form. The government of the community, to the extent that this term is appropriate, is the Council of Ministers, consisting of representatives of democratically elected national governments. The work of the Commission should cease to be legislative in any sense. It should be an administrative body, like any professional civil service, and it should not initiate policy, but rather carry it out. In doing this, it should be subject to the scrutiny of the European Parliament, acting on the model of Commons Select Committees. In that way, whatever collective policies or regulations are required would emerge from deliberation between democratic governments accountable to their national parliaments, rather than being imposed by a bureaucracy with its own agenda.
People will say, does my voice count? Can I do anything? And therefore they leave it to a tiny, well-organized minority. Now you ask, have people learned? Yes, they are learning that if you do leave it to that tiny, well-organized minority, unpleasant things happen.
A single institutional structure of its nature tends to place too much power in the central authorities. Then let's skip ahead to the day of the artificially constructed megastate has gone. So the Euro-federalists are now desperately scurrying to build one. The Swedish-style welfare state has failed, even in Sweden. So the Euro-statists press ahead with their social chapter. Large-scale immigration has in France and Germany already encouraged the growth of extremist parties. So the European Commission is pressing us to remove frontier controls. If the European community proceeds in the direction which the majority of member state governments and the Commission seem to want, they will create a structure which brings insecurity, unemployment, national resentment, and ethnic conflict.
Brilliant. Then define each.
5 minutes, Prime Minister.
Thank you, Sam.
Go the blue.
PM95 clear.
Copy that. Go for blue, PM95 clear.
Yes?
Insecurity because Europe's protectionism?
Insecurity. Insecurity because Europe's protectionism will strain and possibly sever that link with the United States on which the security of the continent ultimately depends. Unemployment, because the pursuit of policies of regulation will increase costs and price European workers out of jobs. National resentment, because a single currency and a single centralized economic policy which will come with it will leave the electorate of a country angry and powerless to change its conditions. Ethnic conflict, because not only will the wealthy European countries be faced with waves of immigration from the south and from the east. Also, within Europe itself,
1 minute,
the effect of a single currency and regulation of wages and social costs will have one of two consequences. One, either there will have to be a massive transfer of money from one country to another, which will not in practice be affordable. Or, two, there will be massive migration from the less successful to the more successful countries.
She was opposed to closer political integration. She delivered a famous speech in the Belgian town of Bruges in which she railed against a European superstate exercising new dominance from Brussels.
Our choice is clear. Either we exercise democratic control of Europe through cooperation between national governments and parliaments, which have legitimacy, experience, and closeness to the people, or we transfer decisions to a remote, multilingual parliament, accountable to no real European public opinion, and thus increasingly subordinate to a powerful bureaucracy.
Are you quite certain about stressing this next point?
Quite certain.
Very well. I am well aware of how passionate you are about it.
Yes, Richard. We need to stress this point. I came up through years of socialism, and I saw what it did to Britain.
We have arrived, Mrs. Thatcher.
Without doubt, it strikes a chord within me.
Mr. Speaker, all levels of income are better off than they were in 1979. But what the honourable member is saying is that he would rather the poor were poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That way you will never create the wealth for better social services as we have.
The Prime Minister is aware that I detest every single one of her domestic policies and have never had
I think that the honourable gentleman knows that I have the same contempt for his socialist policies as the people of East Europe who have experienced it have it for theirs. I think I must have hit the right nail on the head when I pointed out that the logic of those policies are they'd rather have the poor poorer. Once they start to talk about the gap, they'd rather the gap was that. Down here. That. Not that. But that. So long as the gap is smaller, so long as the gap is smaller, they'd rather have the poor poorer. You do not create wealth and opportunity that way. You do not create a property-owning democracy that way.
Standing by, Mrs. Thatcher.
Just a few more moments. Thank you, Sam.
Of course, ma'am.
Let's pick it back up. Page 9. Communism.
Communism may have been vanquished, but all too often the communists themselves have not. The chameleon qualities of the comrades have never been more clearly demonstrated than in their emergence as democratic socialists and varieties of nationalists in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. From the powerful positions they retain in the bureaucracy, security apparatus, and the armed forces, from their places in not really privatized enterprises, they are able to obstruct, undermine, and plunder. The systems of proportional representation which so many of these countries have adopted have allowed these tactics to succeed all the more, leading to weak governments and a bewildering multiplicity of parties.
I will not negotiate a delay with the EU.
Standing here, I have a distinct sense of déjà vu.
Further delay would be bad for this country, bad for our European Union, and bad for democracy.
The problem in this country is very, very, very straightforward. If you hear people saying that Brexit is super complicated and very difficult and no one knows how to work it out, that's not true. It's really simple. The crisis in this country springs from the fact that the people want one thing and the political class want another. I mean, it is that straightforward. The people, 17.4 million of them, and I am very proudly one of those 17.4 million, we want to leave the European Union. And the political establishment, more than 70% of MPs, more than 70% of the business class, 90% of academics, they want to stay in the European Union. And every single crisis and tension and conflict and argument in the UK springs from this fundamental divide.
Then a short paragraph about NATO, the Americans, Europe, the Soviets, then closing.
Yes. Yes. Mr. Chairman, I end as I began, with architecture. The Hague is a splendid capital, and how much we should admire the Dutch for keeping it together so well, as they have done with so many other of their towns. Some architecture does last, other architecture does not. Let us make sure that we build a Europe as splendid and lasting as the Moritz House, rather than one as shabby and ephemeral as the Berlaymont.
What should be the attitude to Europe now?
Attitude to Europe should be, I think, to listen to what the people feel about it.
I'm gonna take you on a ride. We're gonna burn through the night. Why you're so salty? I'll still take a bite.
Okay, we can take my Lambo. I'll put on a tight show. You sure you can handle? We be faster than Django.
So salty, I'll still take a bite.
We can take my Lambo. I'll put on a tight show. You sure you can handle? We be faster than Django.
Can't stop, won't stop. I can't stop, won't stop. I can't stop, won't stop. Can't stop.
Can't stop, won't stop. Can't stop, won't stop. Can't stop, won't stop. Can't stop.
So